U.S. federal government should repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So Olivia and I are going to be first on neg. We negate. Section 230 is defined as law protecting media platforms from liability for harmful content posted by users and third parties. A repeal is by definition a complete removal. That means any instance that we prove that Section 230 is beneficial means you're going to vote for neg because a repeal would be all encompassing. With that, our first contention is startups, as without Section 230, startups couldn't handle monitoring all posts. Nabil in 2021 writes that if Section 230 is repealed altogether, any tech companies can be subject to lawsuits for any material posted by any user. Repealing is expected to result in a barrage of frivolous lawsuits against tech companies. Only the largest can afford to fight such a wave of litigation. Smaller firms may just cease altogether to avoid court costs. And by deterring small companies, this repeal will further entrench big tech's market dominance and protect them from future competition. Death by 1,000 cuts would kill small businesses and cement big tech's monopoly, as Harmon in 2019 writes that Google, Facebook, and Twitter are likely to survive any change to Section 230. Those companies have the staff to review users' posts and the legal resources necessary to comply. Future legislation to erode Section 230 would further harden Facebook and Google from meaningful competition. And the impact is the economy, as small businesses would be forced to censor speech or discouraged from entering the market in the first place. Cox in 2021 explains that creating liability would cause web hosts to purge their networks of any controversial speech. Removing 230's protections would essentially destroy Wikipedia, Craigslist, Etsy, and any individual online seller. Small businesses are the lifeblood of America's economy. Indeed, just Etsy quantified that sellers contributed $14.3 billion to the US economy in 2021 and created 3.8 million jobs. Our second contention is sex workers. The first and only time that Section 230 was reformed, it specifically victimized sex workers, as Justice in 2022 explains that the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, or FOSTA, carved an exception out of 230's liability shield for websites violating federal sex trafficking law, opening internet companies up to a potential wave of lawsuits. The law likely placed sex workers at increased risk as people lost access to websites used to advertise and communicate about the sex trade and were forced to work on the street in dangerous conditions. Further, the law even hindered efforts to investigate and prosecute trafficking. McNeil in 2023 writes that laws like FOSTA will push illegal activity, including child sex trafficking, into the shadows. FOSTA doesn't prevent human trafficking, it just moves it onto the dark web. The impact is twofold. First is driving trafficking underground. FOSTA only made sex trafficking harder to track, as Brown in 2021 finds that since FOSTA's passage, the commercial sex ad market has become fragmented. This heightens already existing challenges, gathering tips and evidence, according to DOJ officials, where sites sex workers previously advertised on were willing to work with legal authorities. The new crop of commercial sex ad platforms are much less responsive. As a result, finding victims and building cases off of them is more difficult. Critically, platforms such as Craigslist shut down its entire personal sections in the wake of FOSTA. Without content out in the open, police can't track it. That's why in San Francisco alone, CBS reported a 170% jump in human trafficking connected to the federal shutdown of certain websites. The risk of exacerbating traffic is too big. DeliverFund estimates that up to 50,000 women and children are forced into sex trafficking annually in the US. The second impact is increasing violence, as without online platforms, sex workers are forced to meet dangerous clients in person. And Hauser in 2018 warns that online platforms make sex workers safer. For example, there was a 17% decrease in homicide of female victims after Craigslist erotic services were introduced. And without online platforms, sex workers will be forced from indoor working conditions to the streets, where they face an increased risk of violence, STIs, and exploitation. These women have no other alternative, as Tung in 2020 finds that sex workers frequently face barriers to other form of labor. 70% say FOSTA affected their financial situation negatively. And remember, there are lives at stake, as Sawicki in 2019 quantifies that in the US, there are estimated to be 1 to 2 million sex workers. Thus, we negate.
I'm Lucas, speaking first for the AF. All right. We affirm contention 1 is terrorism. NDCP 23 funds that terrorists use social media to conduct training, recruiting, and intelligence gathering. Rubitsky 19 furthers that groups garner recruits, spread propaganda, and create virtual education for followers online, directly radicalizing 90% of extremists. Section 230 is responsible. Hanley 21 explains that Section 230's immunity gives the private sector no accountability. Critically, as platforms promote extremist content via echo chambers and addictive recommendation algorithms, Section 230's liability shield has given companies no incentive to moderate objectionable content. Fortunately, Freilich 18 of the Brooklyn Law Review concludes that repealing Section 230 eliminates the liability shield. The impacts are twofold. First, right-wing extremism. Fishman 23 of the Brookings Institution contextualizes when Section 230 became law, anti-Semitic and white supremacist websites in the U.S. skyrocketed. Crucially, Ray 22 warns that a hate crime occurs every hour in the U.S. as the past 20 years of Section 230 have doubled hate groups. Nearly 3 in 4 murders classified as domestic terrorism are committed by right-wing extremists, devastating millions of families. Second, ISIS. Macintosh 23 confirms that ISIS-K recruits have doubled in less than a year to 40,000 terrorist fighters attributable to social media. Vitally, Selden 23 writes that ISIS has its sights set on the West and could launch an attack on the U.S. homeland in months, using media to plot attacks that put hundreds of millions at risk. Contention 2 is trafficking. The unregulated internet is a breeding ground for sex trafficking. McGlynn 22 analyzes, because of Section 230, online entities have avoided liability for the activities of users. As a result, human trafficking has skyrocketed from fewer than 10,000 reports of child exploitation in 1999 to 21 million in 2021. Indeed, Citron 18 corroborates that because of Section 230's immunity provision, efforts to hold social media companies responsible have failed, as courts have extended a safe harbor to companies. While traffickers use online boards and social media to identify and groom victims, McGlynn furthers that Section 230 has ensured companies are never held liable. Therefore, affirming strikes at the root of the crisis, compelling companies to crack down on trafficking occurring through their platforms. The impact is significant. The State Department confirms that there are over 27 million victims of human trafficking worldwide at any given time. Repeal 22 concludes that trafficking abuses people's basic rights and dignity, a modern form of slavery. Contention 3 is Trump. A weakening economy, crises in Israel and Ukraine, and a right wing galvanized by Trump's legal troubles have Biden in hot water. Zitner from December verifies that Biden sports the lowest approval rating of his presidency and consistently trails Trump in nationwide polls by 4%. Trump will weaponize social media misinformation to tilt the election. Klepper 23 argues Trump demonstrates a keen ability to use social media to amplify misinformation and will hinge his 2024 campaign on such efforts. Internet misinformation disseminated by the Trump campaign and outside actors swung 2016 in Trump's favor and threatened to play a major role in 2024 as well. Affirming empowers internet companies to fight back against such misinformation campaigns. Huang 20 indicates that repealing Section 230 would enable platforms to rapidly develop and implement measures to mitigate the effects of political disinformation far more effectively than regulatory or court-driven approaches. This is key, as Filer from last month warns that swing voters will decide the election by swayed by fake news, making the availability of trustworthy information paramount to keeping Trump out of office. The impacts are twofold. First, climate change. Debicki 21 writes that Trump's re-election dramatically increases the climate risks because of the massive additional emissions his fossil fuel boosting policies could cause, as much as 3.1 gigatons by 2035, or over 4 times the entire carbon footprints of Canada. This alone is critical. As Elliott 17 writes, each degree Celsius increase in global temperature on average reduces crop yields by 7.4%, causing hundreds of millions to starve. Second, trade war. Barrow 20 predicts that Trump will be free to impose more tariffs on China in the second term, escalating the trade war to unforeseen levels. Critically, Sheets 19 warns the trade war would escalate a global recession would ensue due to massive declines in global trade. Recessions are globally devastating, as the IMF 13 finds that a recession would push 900 million people into poverty. Thus, we affirm.
To start off, since we spoke first, can we have the first question?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so considering that unless domestic terrorists explicitly call for violence, their speech is going to be protected under the First Amendment, how do we expect platforms to censor this information?
The First Amendment has specific, exceptions in particular, and that speech causes harm to other people. So in this case, we're talking about domestic extremists, right-wing terrorists. Those people will be under that exception in the First Amendment, also causing harm. So as a result, if we had Section 230 repealed, that would be able to solve for those issues as well.
But voicing their First Amendment right, if they're not actively calling for violence, they're simply like expressing right-wing opinions, how is that protected under the First Amendment?
We're not talking about right-wing opinions. More so, it's their activities and operation as right-wing terrorists, specifically recruiting and having propagating propaganda as well. That's all under their operations, which would be excluded.
All right.
You get a question real quick. Awesome. So under second contention, you talk about FOSTA, but isn't FOSTA under your world the status quo, which you're advocating for on the neg?
That's the status quo, but we're showing that like the precedent of making reforms and a complete repeal to Section 230, which would be even worse, just makes the status quo worse.
But just to be clear, your impacts that you indicate, which you say for trafficking underground, and also talk about increasing violence, all of which are caused by FOSTA, which is your world if the judge or whatever entity votes for your side, right?
Sure, it's our world, but like we're doing that, like remember like the comparatives that we put on the top, and that like repeal is a complete repeal and that there's no opportunity for reform of sorts. So it would just like exacerbate the problems that already exist, as evident by FOSTA, for example. All right, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So when you talk about sex trafficking, for example, like the quantification that you read is worldwide and not really US specific. So, firstly, how do we evaluate it? And second of all, how do we directly correlate those numbers of sex trafficking to FOSTA specifically or Section 230 specifically?
Yeah. So first of all, we'd say also that your second contention as a whole is based off of nebulous numbers because it's about the status quo. But secondly, we would also say that our numbers about, the domestic or domestic trafficking, they take place mostly in the US, and they're at a very large amount in the US. But thirdly, we'd also say that all these activities happen because of Section 230. If we were to, remove it, that would get a large majority of those sex trafficking numbers down, which would help a lot of people. We say that's pretty significant.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. So under C1, you talk about startups, but specifically in your impact, you talk about these, Etsy shops or, Craigslist. Those are only a small portion of small businesses, right? If you're not impacting to the entire economy or like small business as a whole.
Right, sure. But those are just examples of small businesses that have a huge effect on the economy. Remember when we tell you that Etsy contributed $14.3 billion to the US economy, showing its importance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
Olivia, do you want to take prep? Are we good?
No, I'm good. It's just gonna be straight down the case if y'all are ready. Cool. Start on terrorism. Turn this argument because any benefits created by repealing 230 harm the most in need. First, on the link level, yes, terrorists do recruit on social media, but censorship makes things worse. York in 2020 warns that content moderation systems can lead to the deletion of vital information, such as evidence of human rights violations or war crimes. For example, the Syrian Archive, an NGO dedicated to archiving evidence of atrocities committed during the Syrian civil war, report that hundreds of thousands of videos of war atrocities are removed from YouTube annually. Content that depicts human rights violations but has been tagged as terrorist by algorithms could be deleted forever across multiple platforms. On the second impact about ISIS, they read this Macintosh evidence, yet the only time the article says the word social media is when discussing the Afghan Witness Project, which uses media to track and publicize information about terrorist attacks. Increasing censorship means these groups wouldn't be able to provide such data. Their evidence also says terrorism is increasing, but it names the cause as Afghanistan being the military pullout, not 230. Then turn it further, as repealing 230 will disproportionately target Muslim communities. Kelly explains that it is impossible for humans or algorithms to consistently get the nuances of activism, counter speech, and extremist content right. The result is that many instances of legitimate speech are falsely categorized as terrorist content and removed. Moderation mistakes fall disproportionately on Muslim and Arab communities. It also hinders journalists because they cannot view or share this content. Documentation and discussion of terrorist attacks is essential. Government actors often label political opposition as terrorists. Section 230 ensures platforms make these choices on their own calls, not the government whims. And on the first domestic impact, you can delink it considering Cato writes in 2021 that racist and conspiratorial content is protected under the First Amendment and likely would not be censored, Section 230 or no Section 230. But then on to the second contention. First, this argument isn't unique because Section 230 doesn't protect trafficking now. Smith highlights the courts have ruled Facebook is not shielded by 230 for sex trafficking recruitment that occurs on its platform. 230 is not a lawless no man's land on the internet. Instead, as we argue in our case, if you repeal 230, the only thing being censored would be legal sex work, who are then forced to work on the streets, making them more likely to be trafficked, the very thing the act claims to be against. That's why Freedom United found immediately after amending Section 230, the number of street-based sex workers tripled, and there was a 170% increase in human trafficking cases, both connected to the federal shutdown of sex for sale websites. The status quo of changing 230 made things worse. Yes, we're defending the status quo, but we're telling you that the change is what made things worse. Don't change it more. But then finally on to Trump. Turn the argument considering major platforms currently censor Trump and his rhetoric, only pushing it further underground. For example, Howell explains on January 6th was planned on unmoderated closed spaces where only people with fringe and extremist ideologies spend their time. Even if mainstream platforms further restrict Trump and the violent rhetoric of some of his followers, those followers are just going to migrate and empower fringe platforms. Feeney confirms that shortly after the Capitol attack, the most popular social media firms took action against content associated with the incident. This encrypted chat services then surged in new users without the service or law enforcement being able to be privy to the conversations. But moreover, Moreover, this entire contention is based on predicting the results of the 2024 election. Remember, we thought there was going to be a red wave at the midterms, and there wasn't. Abortion, gun control, or any number of reasons change how we vote. You cannot predict that. But on the first impact, note that Biden isn't solving climate change. The argument isn't unique. Komikov explains in 2022 that Biden has failed to enact the policies he touted on the campaign trail, and even a fully intact Biden plan would have fallen short. And Brown furthers that without big reductions in China's emissions, the world cannot be climate change. China means the climate change may be doomed regardless of who leads the US. But then finally, on to the trade war second impact. Packard in 2023 rates that the Trump administration was the first to impose tariffs on Chinese goods, which was then subsequently embraced by President Biden. The clash has dramatically expanded under Biden in both scope and magnitude, which shows signs of growing worse in the months ahead. Clearly, things aren't improving under Biden. For all of these reasons, we negate.
Start the time now. On our argument about terror, they label a lot of things terms, but don't have any offensive implications. None of these terms have impacts, nor do they have any links to the terrorism argument. So I'm going to group all of them. All this gets taken out by the fact that they don't contest our actual link. That when you repeal Section 230, these firms are now compelled to actually take down content that could lead to the creation of recruitment of terrorism and the proliferation of terrorist attacks. This means two things. A, this takes out the argument about atrocities, because if attacks are less likely to happen, these atrocities are less likely to happen, meaning we are a greater link into solving for their turn rather than just posting these pictures of the atrocities after they happen. And B, our right-wing terror argument also takes their argument about targeting Muslim communities out, because right-wing terrorism has done a lot more damage to Muslim communities than censorship, which they don't even quantify. Specifically, let's respond to the Muslim community's turn. They don't do any warning as to why it'll be algorithms that do the censorship. Google and all these other social media platforms have massive teams that actually work on the censorship platforms. Many of them are staffed by global people from diverse backgrounds. This doesn't matter. On trafficking, they say that Section 230 is in the lawless no man's land. This doesn't matter insofar they've considered the McGlynn uniqueness that indicates that trafficking has skyrocketed to over 21 million people trafficked right now, which means that the only risk of solvency is in the AF. I'll get to trafficking more on their case. On Trump, they start with a turn saying the major platforms are currently censoring Trump and is pushing his activities underground, which makes it more dangerous. However, major platforms post-Jan 6 censored Trump and push into platforms like Truth Social. However, Truth Social has died. No one's using Truth Social right now. In fact, the biggest impacts of Trump's presidency and the way he got elected was through Twitter and Facebook. And they're saying firms are taking action against Trump right now. That's just not true. Trump is back on Twitter and Facebook, meaning that we need to repeal Section 230 to get him off these platforms. We'll go for our impact on trade war. They say Biden's implementing tariffs. Our argument is that Trump has the incentive to ramp up the trade war because he no longer has to worry about getting reelected. Therefore, he's going to take it up to unforeseen levels, causing a recession. Let's go to their case. At the top of their case on startups at the uniqueness level, the digital platforms are already highly monopolized. Even if they don't reach the textbook level of monopolistic market saturation, Kim 23 indicates that platforms like Google operate like monopolies anyway, pushing their services onto consumers over others. On the link level, Hanley 21 argues that courts have invoked Section 230 to grant big tech companies immunity from antitrust suits. Three implications. This turns their link because affirming removes the barrier to antitrust, reducing monopolization and improving the startup ecosystem. Prefer our link on uniqueness per the Kim evidence above. B, it takes out their link because the precedent resultant from Section 230 will continually be invoked to strike down antitrust regarding anti-competitive practices, killing small businesses. And C, it's independent offense as Hanley furthers the Section 230 immunity enables YouTube and Facebook to promote false and extremist content to addict users, supercharging our C1 and C3. Second, the platforms likely to face suits in the AF will be fringe platforms that amplify extremists and conspiracy theorists, ensuring that these platforms can't compete. A, doesn't get their access to their massive economy-wide impact, and B, is independently offensive for us because these platforms like Parler and Truth Social are hotbeds for right-wing terror and sex trafficking. On sex workers. At the top shelf, A, they have no uniqueness for two reasons. B, their own CBS evidence reports that it's federally illegal to advertise sex work online, meaning that with or without affirming, regulators will track these sites down and remove them, which is what happened in San Francisco. That is their empiric. B, our McGlynn evidence from our case finds that sex trafficking is skyrocketing. The AF is a risk of solvency here, meaning if sex trafficking is a bind, you default AF. Second, their premise is that affirming will push sex work underground, implying that the internet is somehow surveillable. However, trafficking and sex work occurs on the dark web, which are outside the purview of platforms that are impacted by Section 230 repeal anyway. Google can't take down stuff that's on like websites like Tor and the Silk Road. Third, post-AF, sex work won't just disappear off the internet. Their link evidence indicates that foster targeted prostitution, which isn't a federal crime, causing sex work sites to go down. If anything, sex work becomes safer post-AF, as platforms be forced to remove content involving children or trafficked individuals, ensuring that only consenting adults participate in the online sex trade. Throughout their case, they conflate sex work and sex trafficking. However, these platforms post-affirming are not going to take down sex work. Rather, they'll take down sex trafficking, which we'd argue turns their argument overall because we make sex work safer on the whole, divorcing it from sex trafficking.
So right at the end of the rebuttal, we hear that they're only going to be targeting sex trafficking, not sex work. How do you respond to the fact that they have already been targeting sex work, and that's why we have seen such an increase in violence against sex workers?
Hey, sorry, where's the question? What was your question again?
Right. So you say they're only going to target sex trafficking, not sex work, but they've
Right,
already
because
targeted.
sex work is federal is legal generally. Is illegal. It's like between consenting adults, it's legal. There's no reason to target it.
So then why have they already been doing that?
Because FOSTA specifically makes advertising sex work online a federal crime. Independent of this debate, or independent of Section 30, FOSTA makes that a crime. FOSTA exists regardless of affirming, negating, whatever, right? This is gonna always be a crime. So I don't
If you repeal Section 230, then you wouldn't be keeping the amendment. But FOSTA literally stands for sex trafficking. It's not about sex work. It's that these
Right,
companies get
it's
scared they're going to get implicated in
right, but it's
lawsuits.
been your own evidence says that it's been used, weaponized to take sex. It's been interpreted by the courts, and it's been used by regulatory agencies to take sex work off the internet. So it's not just
Exactly. That's the problem.
so that's FOSTA is the status. I'm getting really confused. FOSTA is the status quo. If you repeal that, you're different than the status quo. I'll take a question. You talk about sorry, I'll just pull up the flow. Sorry. You talk about on RC1 that censorship makes censorship makes things worse because the evidence gets deleted. What is the use of the evidence just to like document that things happened? Is there anything that is there an impact to that?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. Yes, it is to document and to ensure that governments can't just do whatever they want. That's one. It's the reason that you have your evidence because it's literally these organizations that are providing it. As well as the fact that just like generally speaking, it is important to have checks back on the government instead of just letting them decide what can and can't be on the internet. But ultimately, even if you don't take it and say it's not terminalized, you don't interact with the fact that your evidence isn't specific, A, to the United States, or B, to the fact that we're talking about like after the United States pulled out. So it's not really talking about social media, but rather military action that has increased terrorism.
That's fine. You can take a question.
Okay, yeah. So let's go down to where you talk about Trump and the trade war, about how he has an incentive to increase these tariffs. Considering that Biden has continued the tariffs and is continuing the trade war, how are the two different?
Right, because there's levels to the trade war. Trump, prior to re-election or prior to him leaving office, was heavily considering a policy to, I think there was the blanket 35% tariffs across the board. But our evidence indicates that the fear of like obviously tanking the economy and killing his re-election chances prevented him from doing that. But if he's in his second term, he has no incentive to it. He has no worry of getting reelected. Therefore, he's free to pursue all these nationalistic policies that, like, that he's always wanted to do, or they'll rile up his base without fear of, hey, I'm not going to get reelected because that's his second term.
That's fine. Cool. Wait, Natalie, sorry, can you mute your?
Oh yeah. Okay. Little off time roadmap. It's gonna go. Okay, wait, I need to get my timer up, but it's gonna go just like an overview, and then their case, our case way. Okay. Remember what I tell you at the top of our case. Repeal does not mean reform. At the point where you're completely repealing Section 230 means that you're accessing absolutely none of the benefits that it already provides, specifically relating to startups and having the ability, not having like a huge influx of lawsuits, but I'll get to that soon. So yeah, you're going to be voting for neg because we are proving that any small benefit that comes from Section 230 is going to be preferable to a world where you completely repeal it. But firstly, let's go on to our point about startups. So firstly, they say that it's non-unique because monopolies from big tech are going to exist regardless, but we would say that you're getting rid of all of the competition, those really minute businesses that are providing livelihoods for people. That's why you're going to prefer it. Then on the impact, talking about the economy, they talk about like barrier to entry and like addictions and how small platforms are not bad. Let me just explain the link level once again to make this really super clear. So basically, we say that startups can't moderate all content and that there's going to be useless lawsuits coming in, and that big tech is going to get more further entrenched. But more importantly than big tech being entrenched is that small companies are going to be systemically shut out, therefore decreasing small businesses. Remember, Etsy provided $14.3 billion to the economy alone. Now, let's go on to the point about sex workers, also mentioning their point about trafficking. So firstly, when they talk about trafficking, we would say that Section 230 doesn't protect trafficking, okay? It's getting rid of all legal sex working primarily. They give you no quantification while we do, because The fact of the matter is that FOSTA is evidence of the harms that already exist. This is proof that we tell you from the DOJ. Repealing doesn't allow for any reform to maintain these benefits. If anything, it's just going to push sex trafficking further underground. That's why they say that it's going to remove regardless because sex work is illegal. We would say it's going to accelerate the taking down of people's livelihoods who need to do this to live. And then they say that or impact about shady trafficking, they say it's just going to go to the dark web. Sure, it's moving there because of the mainstream censoring happening without Section 230, and then they're actually going to move to the street. Next, on our point about increasing violence, they say decreasing trafficking isn't going to work. We would say we see it happening in the status quo when you have Section 230. So overall, remember when we say there was 170% increasing in trafficking after FOSTA was passed, as well as a 17% decrease in homicide, though, when Craigslist opened it up its sex working platform. There are lives at risk. People need to be able to have access to sex work online, and that only happens in a world where they are protected by Section 230, not by things like FOSTA, which made their lives irrevocably worse. Now, let's go into their point about terrorism. Because they say that they were prerequisite. If we solve the atrocities and they're taken down, then there's not going to be any impact. But we would say that there is an incentive for major platforms to take down this information right now. We literally see it happening. Okay. And there's also no correlation of ISIS recruitment. And because this is like US law, and all of the things that they mentioned are not necessarily US specific. Humans are still going to be problematic. Remember when you look at our Kelly evidence saying that people are going to be problematic within the algorithm, therefore profiling Muslim communities, making this worse. On the point about Trump, really at the end of the day, all of this predicates on the fact that Trump wins, which is just absolutely not true. They don't give you any evidence that people don't use Truth Social. So you're going to be outweighing on the point about sex workers and saving their livelihoods.
So the order is going to be going first their case, and then our case, and then weighing in between. All right. In that case, time starts now. Let's start on their case. First and foremost, they can see the turn in the side rebuttal that Section 230 already provides immunity for big TikTok companies in the status quo. That means that their side of the flow already has the status quo of big tech taking over these small businesses. That's already bad. If you remove that, AFA solvency, but also their max impact is about $14 billion. But first and foremost, there's a double bind here. First, if they're a large company, that means that they're able to handle all the litigation for these lawsuits. Or B, if they're small, there's no reason for large companies to go after small companies that have bigger things to deal with. And thirdly, we also say that they're insignificant. They're only impacting to $14 billion as opposed to the entire economy with trade war that we're impacting to with our third contention. And more specifically, small businesses as a whole sure are the backbone of the economy, but they don't impact the small businesses as a whole. In order for Section 230 to have any solvency or have any impact on their arguments, it has to be a place where there's actual forums happening, discussions happening. You don't see that happening in a world with Etsy or Wikipedia. There's no discussions happening. There's no impact to small businesses. But also on their second contention, you can see that FOSTA is a status quo. All the impacts, all the horrible harms and statistics that they provide is a status quo. That's already really bad. But even more so, this is not GTA. This is not the street. They don't meet in person. Rather, in the status quo, it happens on the dark web. There is no solvency on either side. This is a non-unique. This is a wash. And also, at the end of the day, they have no substantive weighing at the end of the round. So that means when we look at the weighing, we win the round via A. The recessions make the sex trafficking more likely because there's more instability, more people have to go into poverty, to resort to worse ways of going into and making money. We'll do more weighing after extensions on our case. Let's go for Trump. Specifically, Zinder from December indicates that Biden's down with a low approval rating of 4%. More specifically, Klepper 23 argues that Trump has demonstrated a keen ability and to use social media to have misinformation, and that leads to him winning the election in 2024, given Ukraine being bad right now, Israel being bad right now, a bad economy, and also a right wing that's already galvanized via misinformation. You change that when you form the resolution by repealing Section 230. This has a lot of impacts. First and foremost, the rhetoric that Trump has is already bad, and he promotes like abuses and also mistreatment of women that leads to sex trafficking increasing even more, because that has a whole character of the nation being around sex trafficking. But even more so, the impact on trade war is really important. It goes conceded. Barrow 20 indicates that Trump will be free to impose more tariffs on China in a second term. That'll be a lot more than Biden. Biden has been mostly pretty peaceful with China. That's going to worsen in their world. As a result, it impacts to 900 million people into poverty, which outweighs on magnitude, but also links into their arguments about sex trafficking, because that makes all these situations even worse, and even more so, let's extend terrorists as well. The terrorist argument is very clear. It's basically conceded for the most part. All they say is that humans are so problematic. That doesn't change the fact that right-wing terrorism is increasing, skyrocketing, and doubling in the past 20 years. That, as a result, if you're able to remove Section 230, that means you're holding these right-wing terrorist groups accountable. You're preventing that from happening. The Rate 22 evidence indicates that you're preventing millions of families from being devastated. ISIS also goes conceded. ISIS-K recruits have doubled in the last year, and that's bad. We're going to solve that. Thank you.
Can we have the first question whenever
Oh,
you're
yeah, I
on?
don't think you guys are.
Go for it.
Oh, one of you guys have to still like. Okay, we're good.
Yeah, you're good.
All right, okay. Let's start.
Okay, so just to clarify, specifically talking about ISIS, how can your evidence isolate Section 230 and the media in the United States rather than the Afghanistan and the Taliban and the military pullout that has happened?
Yeah, so our evidence is before the pullout, and more specifically says in the advent of Section 230, that gives the private sector immunity, right? So there's the echo chambers, the extremism, people will get more radicalized under a world with Section 230. So that means that recruitment goes up. Specifically, though, the evidence about the attack that's imminent is regardless of Afghanistan. More so it's about ISIS, which is not based in Afghanistan, that's Taliban, right? And this is specifically a subsection, an affiliate that's very dangerous of ISIS called ISIS-K, which is in particular region of the Middle East that's not Afghanistan.
Sorry, which card is that?
That's Selden, also McIntosh. And also,
Okay.
yeah.
Both cards from 2023 after the pullout.
Yeah, but our evidence talking about why Section 230 is the root cause is from 2021. It's before the pullout. Can we get a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. So just making sure so that we're absolutely clear, you know, all the statistics and the entire case as a whole, for the most part, on C2 centers around FOSTA, right? FOSTA specifically, right?
Mhm. Yes.
And insofar as FOSTA is the status quo and all your case is based around FOSTA, isn't your entire case advocating that the status quo is bad, which Neg advocates for?
Yeah, it's advocating for the fact that like any like changes that this taking apart part of Section 230 like caused active harm. So we're using FOSTA as like a precedent, as evidence of what happens when you like completely repeal it. So yes, of course, but we're both like having to defend this like sort of status quo. And
yeah, we understand that, but that does not mean that in both worlds, sex trafficking happens to a very large extent, insofar as, for example, the dark web is where the vast majority of sex trafficking occurs, right? Which is going to exist either way.
So just to clarify, yes, trafficking does happen on the dark web, but as we explained, when normal consensual sex work is then censored, as we have seen, that pushes people onto the street, that's what increases trafficking. And as the DOJ has said, the decrease in it being public on the media makes it harder for them to then track it.
right,
Yeah,
so it happens in both worlds, but your world actively like accelerates it with a complete repeal.
So,
can we ask a question?
Okay, yeah, go for it. But we're going to say that that's not like the 90s, right? That's like the 80s where it happens in person, right? It's the modern day, it's the dark web, it's on computers. But yeah, go ahead.
Not necessarily, sure. So when Trump winning the election is like not certain at all, like that's just like your case just assumes that, yet the harm to small businesses with like influx of lawsuits without Section 230 is inevitable, then why are we going to prefer your argument and think it's somehow
I mean,
more
that's
profitable?
it's not a substantive response. You're saying that what you're essentially saying, could you mute real quick? No, you're mic.
Oh yeah, I got you.
You're essentially saying that other responses should exist, even though I haven't made them. These responses should exist, therefore your argument can't be true. So unless you actually substantiate it, saying, okay, these are not just the fact that these issues exist, but how these issues could potentially cause either Trump to swing the election one way or the other, which were never warranted nor were extended. You're just gut checking the argument without responding.
I think the keyword there is like probably going to happen, but like that's.
Oh, I'm confused. Okay.
That's all right. That's all right.
Starting the overview, remember we defined from the very beginning, repeal means a completely getting rid of Section 230. If we prove even one instance where Section 230 is beneficial, it means you shouldn't repeal it altogether. They never interact with this. Don't let them bring it up in their last speech. But then let's go on our first contention talking about small businesses. They give you a couple of responses. First, they continue to tell that Section 230 provides immunity right now so that there's not really solvency. This isn't true. The existence of Etsy and Craigslist, the very fact that they exist, proves to you that big tech hasn't completely dominated the market. But the Cox evidence is very clear. Without Section 230, big tech would be able to push these out. Then they tell you in their summary that if it was really as big as we say, then they would be able to afford the lawsuits. Remember, the $14 billion that we're talking about is split it up among families. These are individual businesses and sellers that are on a larger website. The website can't afford the lawsuits, but they can make a lot of money for these businesses. But then let's go down to the sex workers argument. They keep telling you that it exists on the dark web because it's not the 90s. Except if you were to affirm, it would be just like the 90s again. You're kicking people off of the internet and forcing them onto streets to work with agencies. Our evidence is very clear to work with pimps. It's not going to be on the dark web anymore. It's going to be dark and on the street. And that's why the FBI has said that already existing changes make things worse. Remember, when we use Craigslist as a form of like sex web websites, it decreased homicides by 17%. This evidence is clear. Then let's go over to their case talking about terrorism. They cannot isolate to you why ISIS is correlated specifically with the media. They say it's before the Afghanistan pullout, citing their 21 card. That's just on the link level. Their evidence is from 2023, and their evidence specifically talks about the Taliban. That is what it is talking about. Check it if you want. But then let's go down to the third contention talking about Trump. At the end of the day, yeah, we are gut checking the argument. It is hypothetical at best. We thought for a really long time that there was going to be a red wave in the midterms, but then that didn't happen. Why? Roe v. Wade meant that people were going to change what they did. There are always things happening in politics. That means you can't do this. This is hypothetical at best. They must prove the argument is inevitable before they can weigh it. Also note on the impact level, they have dropped in every single speech their 900 million card. They keep telling you there's going to be some form of recession. Don't let them pick it up in their very last speech. At the end of the day, if Trump is an irrational actor, then we can't try to predict what he would do. And our Packard evidence tells you that Biden is just as bad as Trump with the trade war. That's why you're going to be voting for the only clear evidence in the round, the only weighing that has been done, and that is for the women and the people who have small businesses, because this is uniquely insidious. They have absolutely no form of recourse. You're voting for the neg.
We'll go the weighing / overview, Trump, then your case. Start the time now. The overview is not much of an overview, just means if there's a net benefit to affirming, you do so. Not too complex there. Let's go to the weighing. There isn't a shred of weighing conducted in the summary. They call some argument weighing in the final focus. Everyone watching this round can tell you that is not weighing. The only real weighing done in this round is Lucas's summary, where he argues that a recession is a bigger driver of sex trafficking than any of their links. Because when recessions happen, there's massive instability around the world. People are pushed into poverty, wherein they're forced to take actions like go into sex work to be able to feed their families, which means that we control a better link into sex trafficking than they do, because we affect more countries across the board than just the United States. That is our weighing, the only weighing in the round. If we win a link in the recession, the round ends, the recording can end right here. Let's go to Trump. They literally admit in their final focus that they're gut checking the argument. Again, everyone watching this round knows that gut checking is not a real debate response. You can't assume that there might be a response and have it be made for you. That is just not how debate works. If anything, we extend our argument where we say that Biden is on the ropes right now because of a weak economy and crises around the world, and misinformation online in the absence of in the presence of Section 230 is how Trump is going to get elected by influencing swing voters to vote for him through misinformation. However, affirming it forces these companies to take this misinformation down, therefore preventing Trump's main channel from getting reelected from ever existing in the first place, which is critical because Trump, without fear of without worry of being reelected, can impose a much greater trade war on China, which can cause a recession. Even if we don't extend the 900 million card, a recession is still bad enough for you to pull the trigger altogether. And even if it isn't, you can still look to the weighing, which is conceded that recession is the greatest link into sex trafficking. The round is over, 1:30 in the final focus. If you still want to look elsewhere, let's go to their case. Their first argument is wholly insignificant in comparison to a recession. $14 billion is nothing. It's less than a net worth of the Carolina Panthers owner. Let's go to the argument about sex trafficking. The issue with this argument is the uniquest layer as it's been throughout the round. A, fosters the status quo. Everything that is bad in their world will continue to be bad when you cast a neg ballot. And B, they consider the McGlynn evidence in every speech that sex trafficking is at an all-time high and will continue to increase. Meaning the only risk of solvency is on the AF, meaning they don't have much of a unique offense. The only weighed offense in the round is the affirmative.